Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining. My name is Kim Kariuki and I work for MSE. I am a banking and financial services specialist based in the Anglophone office in Nairobi, Kenya. So today we are having a very interesting conversation on the role that group-based informal financial services plays in unlocking capital for MSEs across the continent. Now, just before we get into all of that, I came across this interesting statistic that I thought would help set the stage for this conversation. So according to the MSME Finance Forum, African MSEs have a financing gap of over 517,000 USD, which is around 11% of the total financing gap in developing countries. So, if you think about 11%, doesn't feel like a lot, but if you're living in a developing country, that's large. So what we found is that group-based informal financial services are playing critical roles in providing access to capital to these MSMEs, but not just by providing mechanisms to pool savings and credit, but they also do and provide a lot of non-financial benefits and incentives to members, including education, greater bargaining power, access to networks, sharing of resources, and markets. But hey, don't take my word for it. Today, I am joined by an esteemed panel of funders and providers who will be joining me to discuss this topic. We will focus on three themes for this conversation. The first theme is on access and usage of group-based informal financial services. The second theme is on the role of digitization and data. And the third theme is on the role of partnerships. I will quickly go now to introduce my esteemed panel of funders and providers who are part of the panel. And so from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have Sibyl Shidiak. Sibyl, please say hi to the team.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to be with you this morning on my end, calling in from Seattle. I'm a senior program officer on the Women's Economic Empowerment team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The WE team is found within the Gender Equality Division at the Foundation, which is our newest division, coming in only at 2 years old. And I've been in this role for 5 years, focused on advancing our country's strategies and investments in Nigeria, Uganda, and more recently, Senegal. Apart from those countries, the WE team strategically focuses on India, Kenya, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Prior to joining the foundation, I worked for 20 years with a few NGOs, leading approaches in the financial inclusion space, advancing development of the informal group model known as Village Savings and Loans Associations, and linking them to formal financial service providers. I've also worked in layering business, livelihood, agriculture, and health trainings onto those groups. I've worked deeply across 20 countries in Africa and several countries in South Asia and Latin America. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you, Kim and MSC, for organizing this webinar.
Thank you, Sibyl. Next is Phyllis Kariuki from WFP Kenya. Welcome, Phyllis. Phyllis, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Phyllis Kariuki, working with WFP for the last 4.5 years, and I support financial inclusion work in the Kenya country office. And prior to that, I worked for CARE, where I met with Sibyl and Grace, the panelists. And I've also worked in a microfinance bank, Faulu Microfinance Bank, and I've been a consultant for both microfinance and SME. So thank you, Kim, and I hope we have a good discussion.
Thank you, Phyllis. And last but definitely not least is Grace Majara from CARE.
Thank you, Kim. I'm called Grace Majara. I work with CARE International as the Deputy Director for the VSLA Global. I'm based in Kampala. I've worked in the space of development for the last 23 years, mainly in financial inclusion and women economic empowerment. For the topic for today, where we are looking at the informal groups and their contribution to financial inclusion. I've worked in this space, I think, for the last probably 20 years, and I've seen that partly that sector growing. I've worked with women. I integrate financial inclusion across value chains. I integrate financial inclusion within enterprise work, and I also work in gender space where we address issues that usually limit women growth in business, women growth in finance, women growth in everything. Yeah, thank you. Happy to be with you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Grace. And just as we get started, I think it's helpful to frame the issue of group-based informal financial services. So just so that we're all on the same page, these go by different names. In the development space, they are known as VSLAs, or savings groups, or sometimes self-help groups, or ASCAs, or ROSCAs, and table banking groups as well. But then if you look back at your own local context across the continent, there are some local names that these groups go by. So in Kenya, we often refer to them as chamas. For South Africans in the webinar, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Stokvels. For South Sudanese, or for the Sudanese, Ekub, Jangi in Cameroon, Susus in Ghana, Isusus in Nigeria, and Tontines in Togo. So this is what we're trying to discuss today. And I'll turn it over to my panelists now to hear a little bit about their strategies and the type of group-based informal financial services that they support. Perhaps beginning with you, Sybil.
Yeah, sounds great. So the updated WE strategy, the Women's Economic Empowerment Strategy, was finalized in 2022, so just last year, and it anchors the foundation's work around creating income generation opportunities by supporting scalable efforts that promote women's ability to earn and control their own income. Understanding that contexts are different in different markets, we frame this around attracting women to paid work when they want to work, advancing them when they are already in paid workforce but earn very little, and retaining them in the workforce when life circumstances give women few options other than dropping out of paid work. The strategy seeks to disrupt the established livelihood space by testing and learning from initiatives along 5 key levers: capital, data, digital tools, markets, and childcare that can be scaled up to reach our goal of 80 million women across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa by 2030. I must say that through our strategy, we see informal groups as a scaling platform to reach women. Now, in terms of what that looks like and how we support group-based informal financial services, we do that in a few ways. One of the ways that we support groups is in partnership with donor funding institutions such as the World Bank and their government clients, really leveraging larger programs and funding that is being implemented by the public sector. I have to caveat this with the fact that we don't support the creation of groups, rather the strengthening of groups, existing groups, through layering efforts. So we do this in Nigeria with the Nigeria for Women Project. It's the first national livelihood project in Nigeria focused on reaching women through collectives, funded through a 100 million World Bank IDA loan. And the Gates Foundation's investment is focused on supporting the project impact evaluation, the provision of technical assistance, policy dialogue support, as well as 2 sub-awards that provide direct technical assistance by local providers to the project. The support was really done to solidify the design and really provide technical support to teams to implement the project across the federal as well as the 6 project states, 1 located in each geopolitical zone. We are also supporting a Kenya-based World Bank funded project focused on working with SACCOs in Kenya under the 1 Million Farmer platform, digitizing women farmers collective so that they can create the data trails necessary for financial institutions to use in order to base credit decisions, as well as access to farming services across the platform. In Uganda, where we've worked in partnership with the government of Uganda and FAO, we've supported numerous evaluative studies of the Profira initiative, the Promotion for Financial Inclusion in Rural Areas, targeting SACCOs and VSLAs, as well as the Ministry of Gender's Uganda Women's Empowerment Program, and other initiatives led by the ministry, really on the evaluative side to understand how government can use that data in future program design that really works with women's groups. We're also looking at the newly launched GROW initiative in Uganda. This is a 217 million IDA grant to the government of Uganda, which focuses on supporting micro and small women entrepreneurs with skills, mentoring, coaching, childcare solutions, and access to finance. The project uses women's platforms or informal groups to reach women. So the second way we support groups is in partnership with the private sector, specifically through our capital strategic lever. Through our work here, we're focused on partnering directly with several financial institutions, testing and learning around the support to financial institutions to really develop and scale financial products and services and build capabilities that enable them to serve women, small scale entrepreneurs. Often these women are found in groups. So through this support, we're looking to see these financial institutions working with existing groups, which serve as on-ramps for low-income women to move up and access formal financial products and services. And this is in the direction of providing better productive credit and eventually leading women to access commercial capital. And our support here recognizes that women often are in subordinate positions in the household. So we endeavor to shape work on credit within the broader context of capital availability and looking at graduating women through non-returnable instruments like assets and cash transfers really delivered in combination with access to micro levels of credit to avoid poverty traps and cycles of debt, and ramping up credit amounts as women become more stable and starting to manage higher levels of credit. So we'll be partnering with institutions that serve women and support the build of their capacity to really serve them better with better products, better pricing. And our partnerships will really focus on 4 key areas with these financial institutions. So really develop reasonably priced local currency and capital pools with appropriate risk sharing and risk mitigating elements. Utilization of data. So these financial institutions can have data systems to improve the efficiency of their services, allowing them to better service the low-income women, and exploring the use of digital tools to facilitate delivery and improve responsiveness. And last, the provision of wider support through technical assistance for the sector in selected markets. And right now we're looking at Kenya and Uganda to really drive up that work with private sector institutions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sibel. Really, really interesting. I'm always and continuously amazed with how much work the foundation is doing in this space. Over to you, Phyllis. How are you using group-based financial, informal financial services to achieve your objectives across the country?
Thank you, Kim. Let me start by saying that WFP is a humanitarian organization. And our mandate is really 2 things: saving lives and changing lives. So we have 2 key pathways. The first pathway, like I've said, is the saving lives pathway. And then the second one is the changing lives pathway. So amongst these 2 pathways, we have what we're calling 4 key areas or outcome areas. The first one is where we look at meeting the food and nutrition needs of people. The second one is where we ensure people have improved and sustainable livelihoods. And then the third one is to ensure national systems to support the governments, ensure that the national systems are working. And then the last one is to support humanitarian actors. So when you look at our financial inclusion work, it's hinged under the Changing Lives agenda, where we ensure people have improved and sustainable livelihoods. And for that kind of work, and I want to make reference to Kenya. Our financial inclusion work is under the outcome that looks at improved and sustainable livelihoods building. And for our inclusion work, we are in 6 ASIL counties, 3 semi-arid counties, and 13 high productive counties where we work under the Farm to Market Alliance. And maybe I would say that this work started about 3 years ago, and we have we work with CBOs, FBOs, and even local NGOs to promote savings groups. And of particular interest, we work with VSLAs. And to date, I must say we have about 3,500 VSLAs in these counties, and we're working towards ensuring that we are building this VSLA sustainably. And over to you, Kim.
Great, thank you for that, Phyllis. Really, really interesting. Let me turn it over to you, Grace. I'm sure at CARE, you guys have the playbook when it comes to working with group-based informal financial services. Could you speak about groups that you're working with, how many you support, and what's really driving your work around or working with these groups?
Okay. Yeah, of course, the way how you've started it, when we talk about the Village Savings and Loans Associations, or the VSLAs, commonly known as savings groups, we know that it's a CARE flagship kind of approach that was started way back in the early 90s, but now it has spread across the world, whether you are in Africa, whether you are sometimes even in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and it's everywhere. So for why, probably I will start from the why we do it. Why does CARE do it? CARE as an organization, we believe that everybody or everyone has a right to economic resources and power to make decisions that benefit themselves, their households, and their communities. But we also recognize, because being CARE, our focus is more, or our main target are women and girls. Why? Because we also know that somehow women are disadvantaged and girls are disadvantaged. So we do that so that women have equal access to and control over economic resources, assets, and opportunities. So, and we also know that for this to happen, it also requires long-term changes in social norms and, of course, economic structures. So we look at it from different 3 pillars: the agency, where we are talking about this woman and the girl, the relationship, those relations that surround this woman, and, of course, the structures that she lives in. So why we do that? I mean, why we use VSLA? Because in itself, VSLA is a very powerful kind of tool or approach to kind of address all those I talked about: access to economic resources, addressing social norms and gender norms, being a platform for women, providing them with space to sit and talk about themselves, networking, and all that. So that's why CARE, we use it, and we use it across all our programs. We have 4 programs or pillars. We have rights to food, water, and nutrition and sanitation. Then we have women economic justice, we have climate justice, and the right to health. So all those programs, they layer on, or they are layered on VSLAs. So going back on how many groups are we working with, by June 2022, we had over 2,500 VSLA, comprising of 17.6 million people, of which 13.7 were women, and the 35 are youth. So briefly to say, how do we do this? We've done this through partnerships. We've partnered with government. So the approach has been adopted by so many governments, especially in Africa. We have also partnered with private sector, especially for them. The private sector comes in to do a bit of strengthening, and of course the civil society organizations and the communities themselves. That's how we do it. Over to you, Kim.
Great, thank you for that, Grace. I'm just remarked at those figures. Oh, thank you so much, Grace. Sorry, I think there was an internet delay. I'm remarking at those figures, and I think it'll take me a while to get them in context, but really, really amazing work, and thank you all for setting the stage. And I think across the panelists, I don't think either one of us will disagree that these group-based informal financial services are providing like pivotal lifelines for families, communities, and MSMEs. And when we think about access and usage, the story becomes even more interesting. So, some of the documented benefits of these services are, improved access to finance for underserved communities, lower transaction costs, leveraging on social capital, opportunity for financial education and capacity building. But then there are also a number of challenges. So issues around lack of documentation, limited access to larger loans, sometimes there's internal conflict. If you're in the wrong group and governance issues arise, that could be problematic. Sometimes they can be difficult to scale, and in some instances, they are much more vulnerable to external shock of financial services. So I think this being our first thematic area to address, I'd really like us to think about how we can improve access and usage. And maybe I'll first turn it over to you, Sybil, on how the foundation views this vehicle of group-based informal financial services. How do we move them from being a poverty alleviation approach or mechanism to really driving key livelihoods? And a little earlier on, you talked about your strategy. What's driving these investments? Grateful if you could recap that for us.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I think first, our work on really supporting women who are found in these informal groups has focused on how do we actually drive them to be able to access formal financial products and services, because as we all know, when women are in these groups, they reach a certain ceiling where the amounts that they need to expand and grow their businesses reach a limit. And so the group provides a lot of what the woman needs in order to access the skills, the training, the practical experience of managing her personal finances, her livelihood related finances, for initially growing, for reaching markets. But at a certain point, she needs to grow and expand in ways that maybe some of the other members in the group aren't ready to grow. So this is kind of where the foundation has an eye of working through groups with women who are ready to sort of graduate, if we could use that term. So through an analysis on productive credit that we recently conducted in partnership with MicroSave, so in partnership with you, Kim, and your team, through this work, we realized that some of what was built in Asian and Latin American markets to support market dynamic approaches to inclusive finance were not really gaining traction in unlocking capital for women in Africa. And again, thinking of the nano entrepreneurs, the micro entrepreneurs, the small entrepreneurs. Some of what we saw from this work was some key features that were not being seen as really helping to unlock this inclusive finance was, one, the enabling regulation, so the supportive environment in order for the market to thrive and really develop products specifically for this market segment. The strong prudential oversight that's necessary to ensure that as institutions that are engaging with this market are claiming that they're doing so in a way that is not harmful, that is protecting the privacy of the clients, but also designing in ways that is doing no harm. We have heard multiple stories from various contexts in Latin America, South Asia, on people getting into a cycle of debt once they start entering the formal financial sector. And then looking at market infrastructure and really looking at how that could really benefit different players that are in the market. Access to affordable local currency. This is something that I mentioned earlier. This is a big challenge. This wholesale funding that's necessary to drive the ability to reach various market segments, specifically women, nano micro entrepreneurs, is sometimes determined by how much financial institutions have to pay back for the capital that they're able to borrow to on lend. And then a concerted effort to institution building. So these are some of the factors that are lacking in Africa, and where they are seen, they are underperforming. So this reality really makes access to finance challenging, especially for low-income women. And this is where our second way of supporting groups in partnership with the private sector becomes alive. And this is where we're innovating and testing ways for financial institutions to meet women within the groups and support their individual growth and goals around entrepreneurship. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Sybil, for that. Really, really insightful, and thank you for highlighting exactly what's driving this work and the investment. Over to you, Phyllis. When you look at WFP's operations, why are group-based? What are the similarities or differences in how the group-based informal financial services are comprised, or how they provide access to capital for MSEs?
Quite interesting, quite interesting question, Kim, and I think I'll respond from our work in our changing lives. For the last couple of years, WFP has been strong in the mandate of the saving lives. We have done a lot of refugee work in Kenya and supporting refugee communities, and also work in the asiles in Kenya in terms of saving lives. So what we have realized as the missing link is ensuring that these lives that we have saved are now able to get improved and sustained. Because we are, from our years of experience, we know that giving out food and meeting their nutrition needs has been quite challenging, especially in the wake of climate challenges, and especially what we are seeing as the global crisis in terms of climate. So now what we are thinking about is how then do we build sustainable livelihoods within the asiles and the regions of Kenya where we've been working. So financial inclusion has been the missing link that we are looking at, and also seeing how then do we build lives. Once we save them, how then do we transition that saving of lives to changing of lives? And therefore looking at financial inclusion as the answer, and starting with the VSLAs and building on the VSLAs, especially where we are doing our cash-based transfers, and looking at then, how then does this demographic transition in a sustainable way? And we look at, once we save the lives, we look at how we transition into the saving lives agenda. And we are seeing financial inclusion as a very powerful tool to do that. And therefore, the need to have the VSLAs, the need to do financial education, the need to do financial literacy, the need to start income generating activities, and the need to now grow this income, these activities from micro to small and medium, and therefore the need for financial inclusion. We started off with the VSLAs, and this has happened in the last 3 years or so. So we are looking at a trajectory where these VSLAs and the women in these VSLAs and also adolescent girls probably in the VSLAs are able to transition into income generating activities. And we're looking at the agriculture value chains and our work along the agriculture value chains, and looking at financing in the key value chains that we're supporting in both the asset high production counties, and working to see then what is the missing link and how do we finance or support the MSEs within the value chains. So we are working with MasterCard also on seeing how the youth in these value chains can be supported in terms of business development, in terms of looking for markets for their produce, and in terms of generally transitioning them from small entrepreneurs to maybe larger entrepreneurs, and working along with developing markets for the value chains that we're working with, and financing comes into play. And we're looking at not only the VSLAs, but we're also looking at the aggregators and the whole marketing value chain and financing along those value chains. So basically our VSLA work is along the agriculture value chains within the ASAL and the high potential counties. So VSLA is a vehicle, but we're also seeing a lot of financial education being done to transition the very micro businesses to the medium and small, from micro to medium and to small and medium. So basically that's the space that we are playing in, and supporting the VSLAs to link to formal financial institutions, as well as looking at other mechanisms that blended financing mechanisms that can be onboarded to support, and especially the youth demographic.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Phyllis. Really interesting insights. And the point you just talked about, linkages, will come to in the latter part of the webinar. But let me turn it over to you now, Grace. I'd love to hear from your perspective, given the 13.6 million women who are part of these groups, what trends are you seeing that are shaping how we can better unlock capital through these groups for these MSEs?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, maybe from a care perspective, we look at these groups as the, stepping stone to economic empowerment or socio-economic empowerment, but also for them attaining their financial independence and autonomy. So some of the trends we see, that are happening is like, of course, there is now a very big kind of movement that we no longer have to talk for these groups. They can talk for themselves, given that the evidence is there. It's proven. Nobody can say that they don't play a very big role in terms of empowerment process of women and probably even the population at large. So, but one of the things we've realized, over time is like for them to be able to graduate. I don't like the word graduate, but for today I will use it. For them to be able to graduate and sustain that drive, that drive, the gains they have gained, there is need to really kind of work around building their skills and increasing knowledge and access to information. And this one keeps on changing as they, at every milestone. So for them, when now they have started investing in probably profitable, enterprises, then you find that the need for knowledge, the need for information, the need for, skills kind of keep on changing. So, and because of that, we've also realized that there is need also to work with governments in terms of putting in place enabling environment. Here, enabling environment in terms of policies, in terms of infrastructure that would ideally support these groups of women, in terms of services, critical services. I think Sibo talked about how can this woman be able to work in a market, but at the same time be comfortable that her child is probably at school or her child is looked after, child care things and things like that. So we've worked with government we have examples, like in Uganda right now, the government of Uganda is in the process of coming up with what they are calling the savings group policy framework, somehow supported by the foundation. Last year, they issued what they called operational guidelines for self-help groups kind of help the groups and kind of give that, a space and environment to enable them to grow. Rwanda is the same. Cote d'Ivoire is doing the same. So we see that there is a fertile kind of ground for governments to come up and provide that enabling environment. But of course, both Phyllis and the Sibo have talked about it. As they grow, of course, the needs, especially need to capital increases, and sometimes the money they have within their groups is not enough. So we've also worked with with the banks and other other financial institutions to be able to tailor some of the products to the needs of these groups. But that support further, investment in terms of how do we come up with products that respond to the needs of these people. Of course, we are talking about digitization. You talked about, lack of information. Most of these groups don't have, information, accurate information, which goes together with even being linked to the formal financial sector. So that's another area that I see is growing, especially with digitalization. But of course, also needs a lot of investment and also looking into it, especially in terms of how do we come up with those solutions that are able to respond to their needs. And lastly, being care, we know that we can't sustain the impact or the changes if we don't address the social norms that usually, drag these women and keep them where they feel comfortable. So for us, everything we do, we have to kind of increase in the dose of gender transformative kind of approaches. Thank you, Kim.
Brilliant. Thank you for that powerful message there, Grace, on the role of social norms. And also you're tying in on the issues around partnerships and data. So let me go to data first, just because, we're in this fourth industrial revolution space. Data and AI, is a buzz now. What we've seen is digitization has offered an incredible lifeline to groups that originally would have been unable to scale. They now have the opportunity to conduct group activities, meet online, or even if they do not meet in person, the digitization helps them to still conduct saving and borrowing activity. It also opens up new channels. So we're seeing providers who are able to leverage the data coming out of these groups to do alternative credit scoring, to increase access to markets, increase or provide the access to business information and networks, like you talked about, Grace, a while earlier there, and potentially this opportunity to graduate into more commercial forms of lending. And especially, this is important for MSMEs who want to grow and move from being nanos to micro to small to large corporates. And let me turn over to you, Sibyl, on how is the foundation looking at the role of digitization and data to support groups, and how is this informing, your priorities and your strategies going forward?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is an important question because as we know, the digital tools have every 6 months been evolving. I think the talk of the day right now are AI and chatbots and how they can be used to really help advance and leapfrog some initiatives, and especially reaching women. But we first and foremost know that women, phone ownership, smartphone ownership at that is dismal across many of the contexts that we work with. So first and foremost, one of the ways that we're driving digitization and data is to increase women's phone ownership and usage. So that is looking at different ways that women can access phones through lease programs or pay-as-you-go types of initiatives. And then coupled with that is digital literacy. So great, you have a phone, but do you know how to use it? And do you know what the various functionalities that can be done beyond, chatting through message platforms or receiving calls or affecting digital payments through the phone. So these are fundamentally one of the ways that we're working at driving digitization. In addition to that, we are pursuing digitization in a number of ways, and I can give a few examples of what that looks like across different partnerships. And really, if you drill down to it, these partnerships are really driving access to market, looking at how digital tools and platforms can be used to drive access, women's access to markets, women's access to financial services, and women's access to the training that they need to run their businesses or become better entrepreneurs, agents, merchants, etc. So first is with Copia. This is a private sector entity based out of Kenya. This is an e-commerce business, and that promotes access to goods and equipment in rural areas. They're a forthcoming partner to the foundation who will be testing group-based approaches for reaching women and training them as merchants. So through this partnership, we'll be supporting smartphone financing for women in groups to purchase and own their smartphones. And then Copia would also be developing tailored merchant training modules for women, which we're also looking at having them being delivered through digital channels, fostered through the work of our other partner, Arifu, which is looking at SMS-based training systems. The second one is one that I had mentioned briefly already, and this is through our work with the World Bank in Kenya on digitizing SACCOs. And really, through this work with the public sector, we're supporting the formalization and digitization of women farmer groups into SACCOs and utilizing gender transformative approaches to increase women's voice through governance and driving gender disaggregated data flows to enhance and increase service delivery. So including access to markets, access to inputs, access to finance, and other information. And one of the direct data flows is to the government of Kenya's data repository known as KALRO, the Kenyan Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization. So through this initiative, we're supporting KALRO to leverage their data systems as a gender transformative products and service driver. We're working and working to enhance women's access to responsive information and market advisories as well as financial services. We'll be supporting KALRO's capacity to collect, analyze, and utilize gender disaggregated data across the 1 Million Farmer platform, and really help KALRO to develop and implement a taxonomy for gender data, as well as interoperability and open data sharing. So as you can imagine, 1 million farmers, that has a definite ripple effect in the Kenyan agricultural sector. Another way is through our work in Nigeria, where we're supporting the Nigeria for Women project to digitize the VSLAs under that project, so that they and I know you had asked about numbers on how many that we reach in Nigeria, specifically through this Nigeria for Women project being implemented by the Ministry of Women's Affairs. There's about 400,000 VSLAs that have been formed through the project across 6 states, 1 in each geopolitical zone in Nigeria. And they're looking to scale up this initiative to an additional 17 states, looking to reach 3.9 million women over the next 7 years. And what we're looking at here is how do we digitize those groups so that they can start to create transaction records of their group financial transactions and really help open the door to accessing credit from forming financial institutions. And last is through our partnership with CARE. Under the DREAMS initiative, we are supporting digital literacy, digital sub-wallets expansion, and digital access to finance. And if time permits, I'll definitely leave Grace to explain more of that project being implemented in Uganda. Over to you, Kim.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Bill. Yeah, no, I was just remarking again at all of the numbers, and that 1 Million Farmers initiative, leaves a lot there to be unpacked. I mean, that could be a whole subject for a whole other webinar, but thank you for teeing this off for us. And now over to you, Phyllis. on still in the same theme of digitization and data. How is it driving how MSEs that you're engaging with are accessing capital through group-based informal financial services?
Okay, I think I'll look at it from two different aspects, and I'll talk about our work in the ASIL counties. And remember, I said that we've been having this financial inclusion work for the last 3 years, and quite a lot of challenges that are coming up in our ASIL counties, mostly because of illiteracy. Illiteracy being the key challenge in the northern part of in Kenya, and the work that we're supporting. So for those groups, the VSLs that we're having there in the northern part of Kenya, we've been having challenges in terms of just dealing with literacy itself, and also challenges on accessibility of phones and the usage of phones, because in the VSLs, you find that 90% of the women are illiterate. So for them, digitization could be the next steps. But for the youth work that we're doing in the high production areas, we are seeing a lot of youth replacing the methodology, the VSLM methodology, digitization of records, and the use of the mobile money, especially M-Pesa. And some of the groups have already digital saving ledgers, and most of them have replaced the box with digital apps, especially looking at some of the apps for paying, like paying their savings. Some of them are using the Chomoka, what is it called? An app called, I've just forgotten the name. There's an app that they're using, and it's not, so some of them are using apps to digitize their ledgers and also make their payments. And this has created a lot of social cohesion, and the time that they've been using in the group meetings has reduced. And we have seen a lot of increase in financial capabilities as a result of digitizing their records. This is quite, this is work that we've just done. And I wouldn't say that we are there yet, because the groups are still new. They are about 3 years old, but we're driving towards, we would want to see more of digitization happening. Our key challenge would be how we digitize the groups in the ASIL counties, and mainly because of issues to do with connectivity, lack of connectivity, illiteracy, and issues to do with poor record keeping. And also, we are also seeing climate effects on these groups, and especially where the men go to the forest to graze and leave their homes. And most of the household heads are men. And when you look at our work in the cash transfer, you find that in as much as we are doing cash transfers, the beneficiaries of these cash transfers are the household heads, who are the men. And once they go to graze, they leave the women to form the VSLAs, and quite some challenges there. I'm not so, it would be interesting to see how digitalization can work in these ASIL areas, and more so in places like Wajir, Marsabit, Isiolo, Turkana, Samburu, and Garissa. Those are the key areas that we would want to work towards promoting digitalization, but we're wondering if it's too early for us, because groups are in their first and second cycles. So that's a space that we are watching very keenly. So over to you, Kim.
Great, thank you for that, Phyllis. I think it's easy to forget that as much as we tend to think about certain parts of the world or certain parts of the country that are faring better, we have areas that have either are fragile or in conflict that struggle. And I think the point that you raised on the how do you create a culture, how do you overcome some of these social norms is really important to ensure that women not only have agency, but then that they can exercise that agency to uplift themselves and their families and their businesses too. So going over to you, Grace, I think this is a question that's also in the channel. And it's this issue of digitization within groups. And how severe do you feel the risk of defragmentation or group disintegration is? And in what can be done if this at all is a risk to address this concern?
I think the way how you started with a fear, I think it's a fear, but it's something which we can't run away from because it's reality that we need to do it. The only issue is how do we do it? So of course, some of the challenges, some of those challenges that may sound challenges are even opportunities or already benefits. Issues of, like as you digitize where people no longer have to come with cash, sit in a meeting and pay cash. They will have to send their money through mobile money. Everything is digitized. Of course, you know that you are somehow kind of tampering with the social cohesion, that networking, the physical meeting bit of it, that you are tampering with it. So we have to do it and do it very carefully. Issues to do with networking and learning, where women sit, especially women. You know, women thrive. We thrive in terms of when we meet, chat, talk about our children and all that. But with digitalization, if we are not very careful, we may take away that from women. And of course, there is issue of transparency and trust. Remember, like Phil said, that a big chunk of women, especially in Africa, the literacy level is a bit low. So meaning that when you go into a group, probably those who would be able to use a phone, especially a smartphone, could be one or two. So if we don't do it very well, then you may find that it is going to trust, which has been one of the backbone of these groups, why they thrive, why they stay together. So I think that one is okay. But also you talked about the norms, you talked about the issues of using phones, issues of accessing internet and all that. We know that especially when we are talking about women and girls, we shouldn't be forgetting issues of gender, social norms that are related to that. Are we using the no harm kind of approach, where we introducing a bit of engaging with power holders so that we minimize issues to do with GBV and all that. So, but within how do we do it? I mean, differently to make sure that we don't deter women, or groups moving with the digital era. I think what we are doing in Kenya, one of the things we started small, but it has become a powerful tool for us because we started it in COVID. We wanted to hear from these groups, especially women, how COVID was impacting them, how were they responding, and what were their needs. We started small, and at that time it was COVID, and we are using still digital channels to collect that data. But what we've realized that voice, the women voice, for them telling you how they need it, what they need, is very powerful in terms of tailoring our interventions, what we do to what they need is very, very important. But also doing, initial as we start, we need to do proper kind of training, develop tools that could be used, which can be replicated elsewhere if it's done very well at the beginning. I think it's also very important. But also coming up with the relevant apps and digital tools, because they are out. There are so many out there, but are they relevant to these groups? That's the other question. The moment they are relevant, the groups, whether they are illiterate or not, they will have to take on some of those tools, like the mobile money, the way how it has been taken on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Grace. As you were speaking and you were talking about social norms and the digitization, it reminded me of a time when I was, working for a microfinance institution, and we visited one of the Roscas, and there were older women and younger women in the group. And I wondered with digitization coming, would this group still remain stable? And it was quite comforting for me to see that the younger women would stay in the group, and the older women loved having them there because they would train them on how to send money, how to check their balances, how to do this, how to do the next thing. And then for the younger women, there was an opportunity to learn from their established mothers and aunties and other relatives within the group on how to grow their businesses. So I think really, it's with everything, there's the other side of it. And I think I really respect your comments and your thoughts on this. So moving to our last topic for this webinar today, which is on the role of partnerships, and each of us has touched on it some. And I want to go to you, Sybil, directly and ask this question on public and private sectors. How can the public and the private sector, how can they collaborate effectively to ensure greater access of capital to MSEs?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think this is definitely an aspect that I touched on slightly in some of the examples given, but maybe just to highlight a bit more. When we're looking at public sector, they have a very specific and distinct role, and I think their role focuses around creating policies that can stimulate private sector to address pressing needs that can help grow the economy. And really creating, the public sector needs to create that conducive environment for those various market actors to do so. So it's a very challenging role. I'm not trying to simplify it. There's many ministries that work in various countries to really look at what are the issues at hand within their remit, and how do they develop the right policies to address that and really, like I said, stimulate the market. But I think particularly when we look at financial inclusion and some of the gaps and weaknesses that I had identified and articulated earlier resonate with where there needs to be just more increased focus in order for sort of the public sector to do its role so that the private sector can respond. And really, I think that one way is really helping to bring down the cost of borrowing. So when we look at the cost of funds that financial institutions have to pay, they can't just, acquire the funds and not pay it back in a way that puts them into debt. So they have to carry out the cost of borrowing onto their clients. So looking at how that could be structured in a way, how they can access low-cost capital, I think should be a priority of the governments, of public sector, to really bring down that cost of borrowing, so that as we look at the way that it's given to the borrowers, it's not something that's too high and unattainable, because sometimes women do have access to a financial institution. They do walk in the door of a bank without removing their sandals, but once they sit down and look at the terms and conditions that are being offered, they realize this is something that's going to put them into debt. So bringing down the cost of borrowing so that it's not pushed onto the client is a big aspect that I think the public sector can play a role on. The other thing is looking at focus efforts to specific segments, to specific populations. We see this in a number of countries, actually. You hear of affirmative action programs, you hear of quotas that have to be met. But there is no transparency and accountability for actually tracking whether those institutions are actually meeting those quotas, are actually meeting any type of target benchmark in terms of affirmative action numbers that they're supposed to reach. So if there's more focused efforts, I mean, when you look at some South Asian countries, there were mandates that were put in place by the government that actually were a way of stimulating market actors to, develop products for specific segments and meet those goals, or otherwise they would be fined. They would have repercussions. So I think in terms of the public sector, I think they have a specific role to play. When you look at the private sector, they have also an equally important role of actually designing for different target segments, not just for the ones that are bringing revenue and profit to their shareholders, but ones that are reaching the majority of people. And I think it's to their benefit to look at how they can reach market segments that are currently untapped, so that they can be the forerunners. And as we know with private sector, they like to instill and have loyal clients. So getting to them first, I would think, would be a great advantage for private sector to look at. They also could provide some of the wraparound services that are necessary in ways that are beneficial. So I mentioned Copia as an example. I mentioned Arifu, another private sector entity, as an example. They're providing training to merchants, to entrepreneurs through a digital platform. Copia is providing e-commerce and the availability of products. This enables women across the countryside, rural areas, to really start their enterprises, but also gain the skills that they need to run businesses. So inadvertently, when you look at some of the ways that private sector is playing their normal business as usual operations role, it actually empowers and builds up the skills necessary to have a stronger field force and network of agents across country. I also think the public sector and some of the initiatives that I had mentioned before, some of the work through the government of Uganda or the federal government of Nigeria, they provide a lot of those wraparounds. And when you're looking at some of the private sector that's just, focused on service delivery, product delivery, some of those wraparounds are partnerships that they need from the government and approaches to really build up the skills necessary for their products and services really to pick up and take up within communities. And they can't do that. They have their business bottom line. They don't have the bandwidth or the resources to do that. So some of that needs to be done in partnership with public sector. So how do public sector programs that are being implemented, how are they looking at partnering with the private sector so that they, the public sector does their role, perhaps informing groups, training groups, and then the private sector comes in with providing affordable access to tools, looking at financing so that and bundled finance and different finance offerings so that women entrepreneurs can access certain markets, can access inputs, etc. So I think this is something that a lot of governments are looking at. A lot of national development plans, as we all know, factor in this public-private partnership. And it is being done, I have to say, in fair amounts of African countries, but maybe it's not being scaled up. So how do we build evidence of these types of partnerships so that they continue and that they flourish in different ways? So it goes beyond financial services, it goes into agriculture, it goes into health systems as well, which we know the health of any entrepreneur and their families is vital for them to being and living productive lives. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sybil. All right. No, thank you. Really interesting insights there. And let me turn it over to you, Phyllis. A number of people have talked about linkages, and I'm curious if there's reason to be concerned that when formal financial service providers link into group-based informal financial services, the groups will be cannibalized and that may collapse. What's your take on this?
Thank you, Kim, for that question. Quite an interesting question. And I'll talk about it from the work that we're doing with WFP and the work that I have previously done with CARE. So I don't think the VSLAs will run away from formal financial institutions. I think it's a pathway, it's one of the pathways that we are looking at. And therefore, what needs to go into this is working with formal financial institutions where they understand the VSLAs or informal groupings and develop products that suit the VSLs and the informal groups, and also to ensure that once these products are developed, they are also issued in a responsible way. So basically is looking at linkages, the formal financial institutions, in such a way that it's done responsibly, and that we can do through MOUs. I think in CARE we did some work on that, where we linked some groups to formal financial institutions, and with clear guidance and with clear roles and responsibilities. I think this is something that can be harnessed. And I'll also cite some work that we're doing currently with the county governments. If you look at our county government structures, you find that what WFP is doing is that we want to tap into the affirmative funds that are in place already with some counties, and looking at how our VSLs can tap into the same, both affirmative funds from the county governments, from the national governments, and also working with the formal financial institutions. So the way we look at this, and the way we say, and the way this has worked for us, is we have an MOU with different county governments, and with that MOU, we are able to do a joint work plan where WFP brings in some money and the county commits some money, and we roll out activities jointly. And that we have been doing to support the work that we're doing on the value chains, and also some work on financial inclusion. So we are looking at currently now working with the formal financial institutions, and we have a consultant that we're working with who is developing mechanisms to onboard mechanisms that we can work with and also engage formal financial institutions. And we're looking at specific financial institutions that can serve the needs that we have, especially looking at the youth. And therefore, we're also working with UNCDF to develop loan guarantee mechanisms that we can work with the financial institutions, the formal financial institutions, and especially looking at our youth demographic. So what I would say is that it has to be done responsibly. And I think there needs to be a promoter or a middleman who will be able to look at the needs of the beneficiaries, or the people that we want to link to these financial institutions, and develop products. We had some products that Equity had developed, but once the promoter is no longer there, the product is not issued anymore. So I think for the next couple of years, I see the sector working with promoters, and that can be NGOs, it can be government, it can be whoever, to link these VSLA groups to financing. For the county funds, that would not be a major challenge. We have seen this working with one county in Kenya, the Tetheka Fund in Makueni, and we have helped them develop a policy framework and support them along the way. And we're also working with other county funds to support the MSEs, enable them to access funding. And I think what is required is a framework. Some counties have developed some frameworks, other counties are lagging behind. But I think for financial institutions themselves, we need to engage more. We need more engagement with them. And we also need to engage with all the other, there's so many funds that now are existing. We have the county funds, the national government funds, and all these are targeting the person that we're working with, the youth, either the youth or the last mile kind of clients. So I think there's more engagement that needs to be done at a national level to just see that this is done in a responsible way.
Great, thank you for that, Phyllis. I think I've underlined a number of points from your discussion, and for me, I like the idea of responsible linkage. And maybe then turning it over to you, Grace, for this last question. How are you seeing these linkages so far for the groups that you're supporting? And maybe framing it from Phyllis's perspective, are they being done responsibly? Or what could be done to make them more successful and sustainable so that they don't disappear when there's over time if there's reduced interest from the linker.
Thank you very much. I think it's both. There is some financial institutions that are deliberately going out there, talking to these groups, doing research, and coming up with products that are tailored to the needs of these groups. Those products, some of those products are there out there, whereas others, I mean, we all know that most of the financial service providers, I mean, they are profit kind of driven. So for some are looking at these groups, especially when you start looking at the data, how much savings money are into their savings out there, they are looking at them as one of the new emerging markets for them. Therefore, it's more, you'll find that as much as we want to increase access to credit, you find that most of their, you know, they are driven by credit, it's credit driven without looking at what are those needs and how do we tailor the credit products to the needs of these groups. Because for those who have worked with those groups, you'll find that sometimes there is the intervention at the group level, but also the individual level. So how do we come up with products that meet the group and individual, you know, expectations and needs? That's very important and critical. So to me, I think going into partnerships with because you'll find that there are different players within this space. The private sector is more, profit driven, whereas government, as Sibo said, has a role to play in terms of making sure that there is that enabling environment. I've read in some of the draft policies that are being drafted around this space of these informal groups, where there is that element of how do government and others work together to come up with products that are likely to benefit and strengthen these groups and take them to the next level. So I think also the government has a role to play in this, whatever, in terms of policies, in terms of making, we know that one of the challenges, the biggest challenge we had when we were starting to, link these groups were issues to do with KYC, issues to do with documentation, issues to do with, like today, this group has, opened account, these 2-3 women are signatories, they go back tomorrow, they will tell them, no, your signature is not matching what is within our system and all those. So there is need to kind of, review and look at all that kind of space in terms of enabling environment to make sure that it's conducive for both the private sector, but also the government to be able, the groups to be able to thrive in that space. But at the same time, there is need for capacity building. So when we talk about capacity building, financial literacy, bank literacy on the side of the groups, there is need to really invest in, and it's good that most of our governments, they have financial literacy, a strategy in place, and probably they've come up with different interventions. I know some of the governments are using these VSLAs as platforms to, to do financial literacy, which is a plus. But how do we kind of take that as an opportunity to explore and make it better for these groups is the other thing. But also there is a bit of capacity building on the side of the banks or the financial service providers. Most of them, as Phyllis said, they don't understand the dynamics, the dynamics of these groups against which these groups operate. So there is also need in terms of that capacity on the side of the groups. So to me, I think we still have a lot to do. But the moment we do more, and of course, initially even proving a business case to say, this is a new segment, it's profitable. If you come and whatever, we still had, this brick and mortar kind of, channels of financial provision, but now with digital coming in, maybe the cost of transaction will also come down. And of course, even coming in with so many affirmative actions, especially on the side of women, in terms of building their capacity as entrepreneurs. That one also would probably raise appetite for the formal financial sector to be able to come up with products that talk to them.
Excellent. Thank you for that response, Grace. We have now reached the end of the panelists' presentations, and I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I request for additional 10 minutes from the participants because it looks like we might spill over. And to get us into the Q&A, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mandira to run us through that session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim, for that excellent moderation. And thank you to our esteemed panelists for such an engaging discussion so far. And the number of questions that have poured into the chat box are definitely a testimony to that. So without much ado, I'll introduce myself and then dive into some of the questions that we have got so far. So I'm Mandira Sharma, an assistant manager at the banking and financial services domain at MSC. Very happy to have all of you here. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask each panelist to answer a specific question because there are quite a few questions and we don't have a lot of time. So starting with Sybil. So hi, Sybil. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, have you studied the effectiveness of digitization applications for VSLAs? And there are quite a few providers now, from Chamoka to Hiva Online. And what is their impact, if any? And the next part of the question is, how sustainable is it for groups to use their own sort of applications? And are there any challenges with digitizing VSLAs given the illiteracy? Given the illiteracy. Thank you. Over to you. I think that was a lot of questions. I can repeat if you've not gotten it. Yeah.
No, hopefully I got it. Thank you so much. So yeah, I think very important questions that I don't think there's been, for the first one, in terms of studies of the effectiveness of digitization, I don't think that there's like a meta evaluation that's out there. Worth doing a search, and if anything comes up, please do share with all of us. But I am not aware of like a meta evaluation that takes all the various applications and the studies that they have conducted into one sort of analysis. I do know that the leaders, let's just call them that, the Chamoka, the DreamSave, Matontin, there's a number of them out there. They've done their own studies. So I would go to their websites and see what the impacts have revealed. There are definite challenges for take-up of digital record keeping within groups. This requires training at some levels, very intensive training, almost similar to the training that VSLAs receive for the initial group formation, for example, where a facilitator will have to work with them on the various interactions that the application provides. So over a course of time. So, how do you conduct a savings meeting? How do you conduct the loan portion, disbursement versus repayment, the share out, the reconstitution of groups? So just taking the different phases and steps within a group and the meeting cycle, I would assume that a facilitator would need to really guide a group and provide additional support to that group as they are embarking on utilizing the app for the first time. As Grace mentioned, not all, and Phyllis, I believe, not all members are literate. Not all members are digital literate. So also finding numbers of members within a group that's able to actually do the digital record keeping is sometimes where there's challenges and where there's sometimes not that many. But apart from that, apart from the literacy and finding the groups with a phone and being able to interact with the phone in that manner, I think there's other issues of connectivity and the cost of connectivity. I think there's also the question of data trails for what. Oftentimes, you look at the apps I had mentioned, the end user of that data is actually the entity. It's not the woman herself, it's not the group. So how are these apps being developed in a manner where that woman actually has the data she needs to walk into any private sector firm and demonstrate, her financial transactions in relation to the purchase of inputs for the next planting season, how she can walk into a financial institution and have that data be used to determine and assess her credit worthiness. And then the other aspect, I think, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that is being done to promote savings groups and SACCOs is largely being done by the public sector. So governments are quite interested in having these data trails and using these sort of apps. But the one thing that constantly stops them is not, which app do we use? Do we embed a Chimoka? Do we embed DreamSave? Do we design our own app? But it's the cost of maintenance. So as the data trails come in and as that platform is, who's going to cover that cost of actually maintaining that back end system? So I think those are some of the things we need to look at addressing, because this is actually preventing the digitization of groups to really take hold and flourish. It's cost on both ends, cost to the user to connect and be able to have that data. It's about the knowledge and ability to use that data at both sides, but especially at that individual level so that they can take power in their financial transactions and in their histories for whatever reasons that they need. And then it's the cost of the systems that are really upholding that data, who's going to cover that cost. So I think those are the things that we need to look at to really see the proliferation of digital tools within groups. And that's why I think it's been a bit stagnant. That's why, again, time and time you see every single project and program developing their own app, thinking that they can build a more cost-effective solution that they can actually pay for in the short term and in the long term. I think that answers both questions.
Yes, it definitely
Yes,
did. Thank you so much, Sybil. And I completely agree. Digitization comes with the prerequisites, and especially with the target segment that we deal with, we need to have the level of literacy and numeracy to take it forward. And I think facilitators and data trails all are very, very valid points. Thank you so much for that. Moving to my next question, and this is for you, Phyllis. So in what ways can private institutions play a role supporting groups? This is the first part of the question. The second part is, what are the opportunities for formalizing the SLAs to facilitate increased collaboration with financial institutions, given their crucial role, particularly? I can repeat the question if I wasn't clear.
Yes, very interesting question. I would want to start with the second one, the one of opportunities for formalization. And that's why I find that question very interesting is that there's some groups that don't want to be formalized, and there's some groups that want to be formalized. And why am I saying this? And it's a matter of perception, because we asked that question a while ago. Some of the groups, when you look at some of the groups, they say the KYC requirement for formalization is quite high. And let me give an example of some of the KYC requirements more lately in terms of formalization. The group officials are supposed to have a PIN, and they're supposed to have IDs, and they're supposed to some of them don't have proper identification. And then also there's the fear, this is a Kenyan thing, there's a fear that once you produce your PIN, of course, most of them don't have PINs, but once they get PINs, they fear the issue of taxation, and they wonder, so there's a lot of fear among producing documentation for KYC. And that's something that we are seeing more common in groups that don't want to formalize, mostly because they either are not able to get the documentation required, and also there's the issue of the KYC information, there's the issue of producing certificates, and the lengthy, and depending on how far the group is to the institution or to the formal financial institution, they find that the travels that they have to make to get a certificate for the group, renewing that certificate costs money. And therefore, when you look at the dynamics, most of the groups will say that they don't want to get formalized because of the processes that they'll go through. And if you look at, especially those groups that are, I'm going back to the ASAL areas, for them traveling long distances to get registration of the group, renewal of the group certificate, getting pins for the group members, and most of them don't have pin cards. So they find that all that looks like burdensome for the group, and therefore some of them opt not to get formalized. There's also the group that wants formalization, and for those groups that we see trying to go for formalization are groups that are in the third, fourth, fifth cycles, and therefore have understood very well the need for formalization and are able to appreciate what formalization will give them. So there's a lot of need for capacity building before they reach the place of saying that now we are ready for formalization. And for those that are ready for formalization, are way advanced in the cycle, meaning they are on their third cycle upwards. Those are more receptive to formalization and are willing, more of them are willing to get the right documentation in place. And then the role of the private institutions, I feel the role of the private institutions would be more of developing the capacity of these groups and in the financial inclusion space. And I would say capacities are very dynamic because it will also depend on what the financial institutions wants to work with these groups on. Currently, we're working with a number of private sector partners, and these are more of in different spaces. We're working with someone on insurance, microinsurance. We're working with someone on, and I've known of groups that are working with capacity, people to build their capacity, or institutions that build their capacity on health. So it depends on what the private institution wants from these groups, and how, and also building the capacity of groups to understand how to operate in the financial inclusion space. So that's how I would see the role of the private sector partners as capacity building and supporting initiatives on the same.
Thank you, Willis, for that comprehensive answer. And I completely agree with how capacity building is very, very relevant and how financial institutions, the private institutions can play a part in it. Thank you so much. And now my last question is to Grace. Hi, Grace. So is giving external loans to VSLAs not a discouragement for them to save and therefore grow their savings? This is part one of the question. And the second part is, are there any specific providers you are aware of that target group-based enterprises? And if so, how do they offer financial products to these informal groups? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So when we talk about linkages of these groups to formal financial service providers, usually in terms of best practices, it's not encouraged to do linkage for a group which is in its first cycle. Ideally, even the second cycle, but sometimes circumstances take over the best practices, but the group which is in the first cycle, it's not really recommended for it to start accessing credit from formal financial sector, because here you are trying to kind of, this group is trying to, first of all, learn how to work together. Secondly, adopt that savings culture, being able to know how to manage their money and all that. So you are trying to do a bit of basic financial education within this group. So usually it's not recommended. But even where loans have been given to groups, in most cases, especially when it has done deliberately and in a very responsible way, they've done it within the operation, guidelines of groups. So they give the loan to the group, not individuals. So the group, and you find my experience across Africa, because it has happened in many countries in Africa, you find that when the money comes, it's put in, it's added into the loan fund of the group. Then members start borrowing, because that now gives them more money to borrow, but also borrow bigger loans. So I think it's like that issue of how does, the external credit comes into the group fund is very critical and important, especially if we are looking at minimizing chances of leading to these groups being disintegrated. So that is very key and important. So the answer is no, yes and no. If you do it in their first year, yes, it's likely to bring in conflict. It's likely to bring in the group being, being disintegrated and all that. But when you do it in a very responsible way, and probably when you have assessed the readiness, in fact, within CARE, we even have what we call linkage readiness tool, where we assess the group and look at the group whether it's ready for linkage or not. But that's where you have the CARE. But where you don't have the CARE, then some of these best practices have to be shared and taken on by the private sector. Do I know some financial institutions that have funded group enterprises? Not really, at least not even if the credit product is given to the group. In most cases, you find that it's the individuals that borrow. But there are some financial services that have, service providers that have developed group products that are being given to groups for them to grow their enterprises. I think of recently they have started coming up. I think probably Equity is one of them. In Uganda, we have Post Bank, it's doing it. I think even ABSA is doing it. Opportunity Bank, I think they're also trying to do that. So yeah, there is also Vision Fund. So some formal financial service providers are also doing it. And also, when you look at the donors, the Gates Foundation, MasterCard and all that, they are trying also to work with different financial institutions to see how they can better support. Besides that, we also have those affirmative kind of, funds that the governments are putting in, other donors are putting in. They're also looking at it, doing that. And my experience, especially working in the Middle East, that's something which you can't avoid, because in the Middle East, the concept of interest is not there. That makes that fund grow and attracts members to keep on, keep on savings, because at the end of the day, they get a return. And that's how they invest in enterprises. So, but for them, they don't have the interest. So the way how we are promoting this module in the Middle East is we are combining it with a group investment, what we are calling collective investment, module, so that members invest together and they share the risks, they share the profit. So that's how we are doing it, but we haven't reached that level where we are linking them to the formal financial service providers.
Thank you so much, Grace. And I think nobody could have explained it better. And I think the level of maturity and the capacity building aspect ties it well with Phyllis's as well as Sybil's previous remarks. So I think it's a very good closing point. And I'm just going to hand it over to Kim for some closing remarks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mandira, for taking us through that question and answer session. Thank you all as well for taking the time out on your busy day and giving us an extra 10 minutes to allow us to go through the question and answers. A very big thank you to all my panelists, Sybil, Grace, Phyllis. I appreciate your time and for you thinking about these questions, preparing your responses and coming and sharing your insights with us. And with that, we are happy to close the webinar. If your question was not answered, please take our apologies, but you can put it on the channel, on the chat box, and we will go through those and look to address them as part of our future work in this area. But for now, that's it from us at MicroSave. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Thank you all.